Which show does a better job staying true to real life? Monster, The Jeffrey Dahmer Story, or The Watcher? Monster starts strong by adapting Dahmer's apartment down to the dirty pots next to his sink. We are immediately shown Dahmer in the middle of a kill and get our first look inside his apartment. Crime scene photos were used to recreate the apartment where he murdered most of his victims, which can be seen in the real-life Dahmer's kitchen counter in this image from the Milwaukee Police Department. The bleak living room in the series looks spot on compared to crime scene photos.
Let's take a closer look at the details the Netflix set really nails compared to the real-life photos of Dahmer's apartment. Everything is in the same position and style. The fish tank, the blue curtains, the sad plant on top of the typical 90s side table, the small fan on the floor, the eerie artwork on the walls, and basic bachelor lamps. The detail work here is truly incredible.
The show even uses the same beer that Dahmer was frequently known to drink in his alcoholism. The fish tank, which real-life Dahmer would use as one of his excuses to explain the smell in his apartment, was also included in this detailed set. Episode 1 continues with the escape of Tracy Edwards, who, in reality and the show, ran down the street with a handcuff dangling on one wrist, flagging down the cops eventually. Details from Edwards' testimony about Dahmer were included in the scenes of the show before Edwards escaped. Dahmer actually did tell Edwards he wanted to hear his heart because he was going to eat it.
I desensitized myself to it. I
Told you. We're gonna hang out, watch a movie, take some pictures.
Dahmer also admitted he would force his victims to watch The Exorcist 3 before he murdered them. Real-life Dahmer said later in an interview about the movie, "I felt so hopelessly evil and perverted that I actually derived a sort of pleasure from watching that tape." Dahmer viciously preyed upon young men in his neighborhood, killing them and dismembering them, saving their body parts for later consumption. While many of his victims were black or non-white, Dahmer claimed to choose his victims based on body type alone. One such victim featured in the show is Conract Synthasimfoam. Horrifyingly, the police did let the 14-year-old victim back into the hands of Dahmer, who within hours killed him. The show even uses an actual phone call with neighbor Glenda Cleveland, where the police reassured her there was nothing to worry about in that particular incident. Dahmer was truly able to convince police that the drugged child was his boyfriend, and they released him back into Dahmer's custody, one of the many instances of this case that were handled with police negligence. Using details from prison letters, the show recreates Dahmer's fantasies that included dismemberment. Monster also depicts the serial killer's childhood obsession with dead animals. One of the more disturbing scenes included is the suggestion that Dahmer would even pleasure himself thinking about dissecting animals. In real life, Dahmer did learn to preserve animal bones from his father, which is how he would preserve the body parts of his victims. In the show, this aspect was one of the only ways in which father and son are seen positively bonding. In a dramatic scene of the show, Dahmer's father claims to have struggled himself with thoughts of murder, a fact brought out directly from Lionel Dahmer's autobiography, A Father's Story. The characterization of Dahmer's mother is also true to life. Around the same time Dahmer was learning from his father the process of preserving animal bones, his mother had increased her consumption of sedatives, mentally detaching herself from her family. Monster shows the audience an extremely fractured and dysfunctional family. In real life, Dahmer reportedly told a high school counselor that his home life was fraught with problems. When Dahmer discovered he was gay, to say the least, there was not a communicative and loving household to which he would want to come out. He hid his orientation from his family if it ever came up or was questioned, and in the show, his family often suggests he just needs to find a nice girl to settle down with, and that will solve all of his personality problems. Dahmer did indeed use local bathhouses and bars to stalk and assault men. He actually was banned from the Club Bath Milwaukee for getting men drunk and drugging them against their will. The bar scene in the Netflix series, Club 219, was a real establishment, but has since changed names and owners. The show does very much go into lengths to not stray from the horrors any of the victims depicted experienced. And all of the scenes of their murders match up with court evidence provided. Yet, Monster makes a few glaring errors when it comes to information about their cases and how the families were ultimately treated. For example, only 2 of the families have actually been shown to have sued for profits from Lionel Dahmer's book, as opposed to all of them. And certainly, none of the families were consulted before their inclusion of their stories in this Netflix series. However, their victim impact statements seen in the show to Dahmer were taken directly from court transcripts, and at the very least, were not taken out of context in that sense.
You might remember this moment near the end of the series where we are shown the execution of killer clown John Wayne Gacy during a solar eclipse. This moment coincidentally occurs simultaneously with Dahmer's baptism, but there's no real connection between these events, creepy as they may be.
Compared to its striking level of detail, what did Monster get wrong? Surprisingly, a decent amount. Perhaps one of the most obvious change details in the show is the portrayal of Dahmer's neighbor, Glenda Cleveland. In the series, she is shown as a concerned neighbor living down the hall but inside Dahmer's building. In reality, they never actually met in person, and Cleveland lived in the next building over. She did try to inform police of Dahmer's suspicious behavior multiple times, as seen in the real-life audio used in the show of Cleveland's call about 14-year-old Conorak Synthanthophone's near escape.
The 14-year-old Laotian boy disappeared from his Milwaukee home May 26th.
The most noticeable thing about it was the fact that he was nude.
This woman's daughter saw the boy running out of Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment building that night.
Agency operator 71.
Okay, hi, I'm on 25th and State, and this is young man. He is butt naked. He has been beaten up. He is very bruised up. He can't stand. He's study fall out. He is butt naked. He has no clothes on. He was really hurt.
Dahmer's next-door neighbor inside the building was actually a woman named Pamela Bass, who had her own interactions with Dahmer that were lifted for the show. She claimed that he was always friendly to her and would even bring her sandwiches to eat. Once his crimes were revealed, she realized in horror he could have very well fed her human flesh. This particular suggestion is adapted in a scary scene where Dahmer offers threateningly a sandwich to the fictionalized Cleveland, and she later also reflects on the odds that it had been made out of human flesh. Monster accurately describes most of Dahmer's cannibalistic exploits, but like the amalgamation of Glenda Cleveland from Pamela Bass, even some of these scenes were exaggerated for dramatic effect, although many didn't have to be. A memorable scene in the Netflix series depicts Dahmer bringing home a whole bag of blood to drink from his phlebotomy job. Dahmer only ever admitted to stealing a vial of blood and trying it on the roof of his workplace, but ultimately spat it out. Monster further heightens the lack of police action, which was very much a real thing. The reward that officers Balcerzak and Gabrish were given is totally falsified. It should not be misremembered how the negligence of the police led directly to more deaths, and they were suspended after Dahmer was arrested, and they were reinstated to their positions in 1994. But the reward they are given in the show is simply a device to make the viewer even madder at the callous police. Further dysfunction in Milwaukee's system could be seen in Dahmer's real-life overworked probation officer. In a fairly large omission from the show, Donna Chester was assigned to monitor Dahmer after his 12-month prison sentence, which was seen in Monster. The show left her out as a character entirely, even though, as an example of negligence by authorities, Chester's work logs reflected that she was spread too thin to properly counsel her clients. 11 people were killed and mutilated while Dahmer was on probation. Chester even conducted an interview with Dahmer in his apartment. While he was hiding the barrel of acid, the head seen in the freezer, multiple skulls, torsos, hearts, and genitals, all featured in the opening episode of Monster. Dahmer's increasingly sick mutilations, like his attempt to trepan a few of his victims, are even depicted. When Dahmer drilled into the skulls of his victims, it was with the aim of keeping them alive, but sedated and pliable. All of these experiments, however, ended in death. The ways Murphy shows us this is more suggestive than finite, artfully using a dream montage to show us this drilling technique, but, like many of the more lurid scenes, is actually very true. Another large discrepancy in the show comes at the end in the telling of Christopher Scarver's story. Scarver would be a prison mate to Dahmer in 1994 and would eventually kill the murderous cannibal. Scarver's motives for killing Dahmer in Monster are greatly dramatized, like the scene where he prays for divine guidance about dealing with Dahmer. In Scarver's actual trial, he pleaded insanity, and testimony from his psychologist explained that Scarver heard voices and believed delusions that he was the chosen one in general, and not chosen to end Dahmer's life per se. Scarver later said in a 2015 interview, he crossed the line with some people, prisoners, prison staff. Some people who are in prison are repentant, but Dahmer was not one of them. Instead of seeking revenge due to the crimes or victims themselves, this was more of a personal issue between Dahmer and Scarver. Apparently, it's a much neater dramatic ending if the monster in the story is implied to have been killed due to some sense of justice, not because Scarver's mental illness also led to violence. How accurate do we think Monster actually is? Considering the importance of the change details, but the adherence to the factual accounts about the most gruesome and shocking parts of the series, we're ranking Monster with an accuracy score of 88%. Given all the detailed facts that are available, this is hardly surprising. On the much tamer end of the spectrum of true horror, how correct is the portrayal of the story in Murphy's other Netflix original series, The Watcher? The series tells the story of the Broaddus family during the creepy and downright weird period they lived in a house that was being watched. The story of the Watcher house is not well known compared to Dahmer's, which arguably would make it prime source material for an adaptation. The Netflix series is based on an article written about a family's move in 2014 to a New Jersey home, only to be subsequently stalked with threatening letters. To this day, the identity of the letter writer is unknown. Can a story without an ending be made into engaging television? Murphy seemed to think so, but not without adding some of the more interesting scenes in the series. The Watcher uses verbatim text from the letters in the show, which hardly need to be changed to strike a nerve in viewers. The patriarch opens the mail one day in their new house, reading in a mysterious letter, "My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched the house in the 1960s. It is now my time. Do you know the history of the house? Do you know what lies within the walls of 657 Boulevard? Why are you here? I will find out." The Watcher's Brannick family, much like the real-life Broaddus family, quickly becomes embroiled in the mystery of who could be stalking and threatening them, and terrified for their lives, the family did notify the police immediately. The letters in the show become increasingly threatening and dark, and appear to be directly linked to the renovations the family was making to the house. Neighbors were questioned and investigated by a private eye, although not one as interesting as the character of Theodora seen in The Watcher. As details about the home and specific observations about the children were written about in subsequent letters, growing suspicions of others increasingly create tension for the family. The father becomes obsessed with the identity of their tormentor. Some of the neighbors were revealed in the investigation in real life to be worthy of suspicion, being known to struggle with mental illness. And other neighboring homes did in fact have their lawn chairs facing the family's porch. In the show, Dean Brannick's portrayal as a man driven to compulsion is true to Derek Broaddus's real-life reaction to the Watcher letters. Accusations culminate in aggravated behavior toward their neighbors, much like Broaddus did in reality. The ways in which the character acts out compared to the real Dean differ, like much of The Watcher, from its known facts. Ryan Murphy has turned that lack of information from the case into several plot points that veer completely out of reality. Most interesting in real life, yet prohibitive to making the show interesting, is that the Broaddus family never actually moved into the house, whereas our protagonist Brannick family spends most of the show habitating the Watcher house. The actual family decided against living in the home once their children were directly threatened. What else did the Watcher have to change? While the Brannick family is seen having kids, the Broaddus kids were 3 young toddlers at the time, not 2 adolescents. Any of the events in the show featuring the teenage children, like the killing of Carter's pet ferret, were created entirely for effect. The Brannick's teen daughter, dating a 19-year-old security guard who becomes a suspect, acts as a dramatized stand-in for the security that the Broaddus family hired to patrol the home. Nor was any realtor's dog harmed, but without these scenes, The Watcher would be arguably less exciting. Only 3 letters are depicted in The Watcher, but the Broadduses actually received 4. The first 3 were sent in the span of about a month and a half, are covered in the series, but the 4th letter was sent a few years after the house was put back on the market. One of the creepy pieces of evidence laid out in The Watcher purports that 657 Boulevard sat on top of tunnels that the neighborhood residents would use to wander and even live in underground. Yet, these tunnels never actually existed, nor did the dumbwaiter that so captivates the Brannick son in the show. The home did have a basement, but no inspections have revealed hidden tunnels. The Mitch and Mo couple who lived behind the Broadduses are depicted in the show to be deeply mysterious, staging a murder-suicide, when, in actuality, the most crime that region was ever known to experience would be complaints for parking violations downtown. Those neighbors were investigated in real life and cleared of suspicion. The big reveal that supposedly might explain some of the reasoning behind the letters is the existence of a baby-eating cult in The Watcher. There was never any evidence that would suggest this cult was ever real. There is some real inspiration behind the inclusion of John Graff in the show, meant to portray family annihilator John List. Horrifyingly, List did kill his wife and children in Westfield, but not in the Watcher house, and he was actually caught, while the show directly says that he never was. In a bone-chilling scene, it is suggested that the Watcher has entered the house to scare the family away, but no strangers or intruders were ever found in the house. And there were never any disturbing phone calls made. In reality, all communication and interactions from the Watcher came through the letters. The most solid clue dropped in the show as to who the Watcher could be does in fact come from reality. DNA swabs from the letters revealed the sender to be a woman, was not ignored as the Netflix series depicts. Police actually went door to door in the neighborhood to collect DNA samples, even provoking an irritated complaint to the prosecutor's office that this was a waste of resources. A DNA match was never actually made from those samples, so its omission makes sense. While the content of the letters was not changed for the Watcher, they appear in the show to be typewritten, but the actual letters were computer typed with the signature in a different font. Even this small thing was changed, which easily could have been kept the same. Given how steep many of the detail changes are, and how much time entire episodes and plot points moving the story forward were fabricated, we have to give The Watcher a lower accuracy ranking at 65%. Both Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, and The Watcher will absolutely have you sleeping with the light on, but for very different reasons. The horrors of Dahmer's story are easy to recreate when there is no shortage of bloody carnage to pull facts from. Alternatively, the absolute mystery surrounding the Watcher house created the space for Murphy to supplant this tale with more Hollywood fare, to create a show palatable enough to spooky audiences despite lack of known facts. The primary difference in Murphy's shows obviously comes from the level of violence featured in each, but much less exaggeration was needed to tell the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, which has been confirmed by Dahmer himself in lengthy interviews. There are critics arguing that Dahmer's story should not be told in such detail, especially given the lack of consent from victims' families. Yet the world has remained fascinated with the facts of his case because of just how depraved his actions were. The real-life impact of The Watcher has brought new waves of amateur sleuths looking with fresh eyes at this unsolved case. After viewing both shows, it is only natural to ask, how much of that actually happened? The creative liberties taken made the story of The Watcher relevant to mystery lovers, but for those who can stomach it, Monster is indeed much more based on a true story.